Welcome back to Berm Peak. I'm Seth, and today we're gonna be doing something a little different, but kind of the same. We're gonna be talking about the benefits of the 3x drivetrain. Now, to those of you who watch the channel a lot, that's gonna seem weird because oftentimes I'm ripping these off of bikes because they're heavy and difficult to use and difficult to maintain and noisy. And in a crash, they become ninja stars. But we're gonna forget about all that stuff today because actually I don't hate 3xs. They have their place on certain bicycles. Oftentimes they're more economical, and there are certain advantages that the 1x just cannot provide. Now, for those of you who don't really know what I'm talking about, let's clear it up real quick. This is a derailleur, and this is a cassette. This cassette has 7 gears on it. As you shift through those gears, the bike either becomes easier to pedal uphill or faster with each pedal stroke. This bike actually has a front derailleur and 3 chain rings. Between those 3 chain rings and this 7-speed rear cassette, the bike has 21 possible gears. It's a 3x7, a 21-speed bike. Now, each of the cogs on this 7-speed cassette have teeth. On the smaller end, we have 12 teeth, and on the larger end, we have 28 teeth. This is a modern mountain bike cassette, and it has 12 gears. On the smallest end, it's 10 teeth, and on the largest, it's 50. This cassette has so much range that we only need 1 gear up front. This is a 1x12. So for the range of gears that we use in mountain biking, the 1x drivetrain has become all but ubiquitous. It's simpler, it's lighter, it's more user-friendly. It doesn't become a ninja star in a crash, and it tends to run a lot quieter. But there are still mountain bikes that come with 3x drivetrains, and if you have one, you actually have some advantages over people with a 1x. And in the interest of fairness, we're gonna discuss those today. Let's start with longevity. If you have a 1x drivetrain, that ring up front is always making contact with the chain. On a 3x, you have 3 rings sharing the load of the chain. And so, technically speaking, they last longer. But it doesn't end there. Oftentimes on a 3x, you have a smaller cassette with bigger gaps between the gears. And oftentimes those gears are bigger and thicker. So there are certain situations where the cassette lasts longer and the chain definitely lasts longer because it's a wider, heavier chain. If you have a friend who races enduro or XC, oftentimes you'll see them wearing through drivetrain parts in 1 year or even a season. Whereas you'll find an old bike with a 3x and all the original parts it was born with are still on the bike. Let's also talk about cost. There's a reason why inexpensive bikes oftentimes come with a 3x drivetrain. They've been making them for years and they can just poop them out of a machine for next to nothing. These same drivetrains have been made for decades, and so through economies of scale, companies can get them for a few bucks a piece. Also, the wider cassettes on 1x drivetrains take more advanced tooling to produce. The gears are narrower and closer together, and any error in the manufacturing process is gonna have a bigger effect on how it works. So it actually is more expensive to make. You also need a narrower chain on a 1x drivetrain, and so it needs to be made from stronger material. In order to have a thin, light chain that's gonna be able to deal with those stresses, it's actually more expensive to make. Where, let's say, a 3x8 or a 3x9 can just have a big, heavy chain that stands up to whatever abuse you throw at it. So for the range you get, there is a cost advantage to a 3x drivetrain. Another arguable, sometimes advantage of a 3x drivetrain is chain retention. I spoke to an engineer from a bike company that was explaining to me why they put these on inexpensive bikes, and I was surprised to find out it's for chain retention. When you're dealing with an inexpensive drivetrain where the chain is flopping everywhere, there is an advantage to have the chain going through a derailleur in the front, because that chain is now unable to pop completely off the bike. And so for a beginner that doesn't necessarily know how to maintain their drivetrain, this ensures that the chain stays at least sort of on the bike at all times. So for companies trying to make an inexpensive bike as safely as possible, the front derailleur has a dual purpose: range and chain retention. The next advantage to a 3x drivetrain is my personal favorite, and what I think is objectively the biggest thing you're losing by going 1x. And that is the ability to drop to a lower gear by going to a smaller cog. Let me explain why this is important. I've mentioned in past videos the terrible sounds your bike makes when you try to shift gears under load. This happens most often when you encounter a punchy climb and you have to downshift in a hurry. On a 1x mountain bike, your only option is to shift to a bigger chain ring in the back. To do this, you have to be pedaling and the chain has to climb to a bigger gear. The springs in your derailleur cage take up the load as your chain climbs up the cassette. If you do this with pressure on the pedals, it makes horrible noises and happens often when you have to change gears in an emergency. That doesn't happen on a 3x. On a 3x drivetrain, you can drop the chain to a smaller gear. At the click of a button, you are in a dramatically lower gear that you can climb hills with. There's no clanging or grinding or anything. It just shifts gears reliably, even if the drivetrain is under load. Now, of course, you already have to be in the largest or middle gear in order for this to work, but oftentimes if you were pedaling fast, you are. And when 1x drivetrains first became popular, the Curmudgeons in the comments section were having a ball over this. And there's really nothing you can say because they're right. So riding a 1x drivetrain forces you to change your habits a little bit because a lot of people were relying on the fact that they could drop into a low gear in one click of a button on their 3x. And a lot of people don't want to let go of it because of that. When any drivetrain is operating, you have your drive gear up front, and then you have your gear in the back. Ideally, these gears are completely in line with each other so that the chain has an easier time making its way onto the gear. But on any system with a derailleur, your chain line is not always going to be straight. But this is more so on the more modern 1x systems. Because you only have one gear up front, the chain has to move its way across the cassette and be kind of torqued in one direction. On a 3x, you can get your chain line straighter. Now, having a straighter chain line has a few advantages. It does oftentimes feel smoother. It technically puts less wear on the chain and the teeth. And in certain situations, if you use a 3x properly, it is a reason why it may last longer. Now, the fact that chain lines aren't always going to be straight has been engineered into modern 1x systems. But it's still an objective reality that you can have a straighter chain line on the older 3x system. So I have no proof of this, but I suspect that some people use the 3x as a marketing tool. If you're marketing a bike to a less experienced buyer, well, more gears must be better. To explain to somebody why less gears might be better takes a little bit of explaining. You have to explain to them about the reduction in clutter, the ease of use. But to explain why 29 gears are better or 24 gears are better, well, that's simple. More is better. Now let's forget about the fact that a lot of these gears are practically unusable because of cross-chaining, or that you're adding about a pound of weight to the bike. That doesn't matter when you're trying to get the most features you can for the smallest amount of money. And so especially in department stores, you will see marketing points on bikes in big letters. 21 gears, 24 gears. They're trying to sell you on the fact that the bike has more gears, when more gears is not necessarily what you want, it's usable gears. It's not necessarily a bad thing since these bikes would probably have those drivetrains in the first place. It just seems to be an unusual marketing point that might actually work. The final advantage to a 3x drivetrain mainly applies to people who hate on anything new. Back in the early 90s when suspension forks became popular, there were people who hated on them and said they would never catch on. Same thing happened with dropper posts, and indeed it did happen when 1x drivetrains started to become more ubiquitous. You're paying more for less gears, chainline, wear, blah. It is true that with the advantages I gave you today, you can be a more effective curmudgeon. As your riding buddies are crunching their drivetrains before that punchy climb, you can scoot right past them, drop a ring, and tell them they're stupid for having a 1x drivetrain. When I'm trying to ride as effectively as possible, I will definitely rely on my 1x. It's just better in so many different ways. It's quieter, it's easier to use, it's endless. But sometimes I can be a bit of a curmudgeon myself. I like 3x drivetrains the same way that people like stick shifts in cars. They're slower than new electronic transmissions, but they're fun. When I'm riding my vintage bike around, that 3x drivetrain is a novelty, and I find it fun. I use all the benefits of it and enjoy them and embrace them. I try to get my chain line as straight as possible. I use that dropping into a smaller ring trick when a punchy climb comes up. And just like a stick shift on a manual transmission car, it makes me a little bit nostalgic for when bikes were different. So if you still have a 3x drivetrain on your bike, remember that all the advantages I listed today still hold true. Thanks for riding with me today, and I'll see you next time.